We've decided to end this season, this is our first year of such dialogues, with a visit not by another director or actor-director, but by a producer, and not just any producer. A man who's been hailed in a recent issue of American Film as a producer of the decade, and I believe the single most interesting producer in the U.S., someone who has a sense of what is possible and a sense of how to make visions of filmmakers actually happen on celluloid. It's Ed Pressman, who is very, very kindly agreed to come and talk about the work he's done for the past 20 years. I had an opportunity to see him in action a year ago at Berlin, where he was doing a premiere of a new film. He has continued to work at an extraordinary pace, making 2, 3, sometimes 4 films in a year. He is, as we know right now, beginning work with a kind of native son, someone whose career we followed here at the Walker, Mark Frost, who will, in about a week's time, be making his feature film directing debut under the production of Ed Pressman, a new film called Storyville. So we're very, very pleased to highlight not only another aspect of what makes interesting, engaging, lively cinema possible, but a particular figure who's been a catalyst for filmmakers like Brian De Palma, Oliver Stone, Charles Burnett, Barbet Schroeder, and hopefully Mark Frost. With Ed tonight is a critic who I know many people have read but have never seen or have not widely known about her other work. We have Julie Salomon from Wall Street Journal, whose career dates back to writing fiction, a first novel, who has been writing for the Journal since the late 1970s, who has a degree in law, has a broad range of interests. Her work at the Journal, though, I think is of singular importance. The Journal began covering film in 1983, and she was allowed to begin working on the film beat, and has in that time amassed a rather astonishing array of film reviews, of feature coverage on a whole range of issues of aesthetic and cultural importance in film. She has been working for the past 2 years on a book documenting the production of a major film of the past year, a major film that regrettably didn't make very much money in the past year, Bonfire of the Vanities, and will in about 6 months' time have her first major nonfiction book, this case study of Bonfire of the Vanities, published. We're very pleased that she's taken time out from her reviewing duties at Wall Street Journal and finishing up work on this actually major book study to be with us and to spend some time really over the last 2 months looking at work that has been done under the auspices of Ed Pressman. So making their final dialogue visit, or making our final dialogue visit possible tonight, gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome here to the Walker Ed Pressman and Julie Salomon.
Hello, is this okay? Good. Well, before we came out here, I decided I should do a little research about Ed Pressman outside of what I knew about his film career, so I called his mother up. I said to her that we were going to be here in Minneapolis, and I wanted her to know when she first thought that Ed was going to go into the movie business, and she said she never thought he was going to go into the movie business when he was a kid, but she had a couple of good stories that she thought I should tell you about him. She thought sort of gave some insight into his future as a somewhat eclectic film producer. And she said that when he was a kid, he went to the Ethical Culture School in New York City, and he used to go off to school every day, and everything didn't match all the time. Like one shoe would be from one pair of shoes and the other shoe would be from the other pair of shoes. And she was quite concerned about this, and so she went to talk to one of Ed's teachers, and the teacher said, don't worry about it. It just means he's very interested in everything. He'll be like Benjamin Franklin. So Mrs. Pressman thought, well, okay, well, we'll see about that. Then she sent Eddie off to camp. Eddie, she called. And and she said, he came home from camp that summer, and her little quiet boy comes home, and he's Mr. All-Around Camper. And she says, I always wondered how they knew that, because he's such a quiet person. How did they know that he was so great? And so she said, I should tell you that her all-around camper may not look like, what your stereotype of a film, you're expecting some guy with a ponytail and all of that, and then in comes Ed, but he is the Mr. All-Around Camper, and I think as you look at some of the films and listen to his career, you'll see that he has really been all over the map. I guess I wanted to start a little bit about how you ended up getting into the film business. Ed's family is in the toy business, and one could say that might be fun enough, and yet you chose to go into film, and you certainly don't fit the stereotype. And what was it that first attracted you to movie making?
Well, I think it was a similar process to what I guess brought me to major in philosophy in college. It was a sort of process of elimination. Philosophy seemed to be the most encompassing subject, and film brought together very diverse aspects of my interest. I was brought up to go into the toy business, and film is a business, and I think that strain was very much a part of me, but I didn't want to go into the toy business.
What was that?
I used to try it out in the summer times. I don't know, I just never was excited by it. I can't give a reason, but it didn't fulfill me. And I also didn't want to just pursue, I shouldn't say just, but I didn't want to pursue an academic career in philosophy. But film seemed somehow to subsume the whole, and encompassed all those aspects of our culture, and I couldn't think of anything else I ever wanted to do. And at film itself seemed totally remote and impossible to pursue. I guess when I was at Fieldston High School, I had a teacher that taught modern European history through German film. We saw Dr. Caligari and Matron in Uniform and De Latzmann, and I guess that impressed me on the power of film. I had an uncle when I was growing up in New York. I guess that's the first thing. When I was maybe 8 years old, he owned 2 movie theaters up in Washington Heights. And I used to sell popcorn and see 4 movies a day, and loved the movies. But again, it seemed totally remote. When I was at Stanford, I had a roommate whose father was a director, and we talked about making films endlessly. But again, it seemed impossible. When I went to graduate school in England at LSE, while I was going to school, I got a non-paying job, sort of an attaché with an executive at Columbia Pictures, and I met a filmmaker who was American studying at Cambridge named Paul Williams, and he had done a short film at Harvard the year before, and the two of us started talking about film, and he thought I was a great movie mogul because I had a job on Water Street. I thought he was, D.W. Griffith or something. We were totally absorbed with each other's dreams, and we spent the whole night talking about. We formed a partnership that day, and we were together for 7 years, and Paul really was the way I got into film, because Paul had great confidence. He was the outside man. I was the inside man. And it was through Paul, I guess, ultimately, that the possibilities seemed real.
Well, that's great. And so then you went from that to becoming a producer. And I think one of the things that has always somewhat mystified me, even though I've been writing about film for a long time, you always hear about producer, and I think there are all different kinds of producers who really run the gamut, from having a very minimal effect on what the actual film is. They just sort of pick a project and then leave, to producers who are very much hands-on all the way through what we think of as a David Selznick type. And so I guess what I want to ask you is, what does a producer do generally, and I guess more specifically, what is it that you do, and how does that differ from somebody who's working within the studio system?
That's a lot of questions.
You can break them up.
Well, I think I've operated in a different world than Selznick operated in. I think that there are producers today still who see themselves as the generative force in the creation of a film, but the kind of function that producers like Selznick could provide in the context of a studio system where the greatest directors were under contract, from Hitchcock to Ford, doesn't exist anymore. And in those days, the producer was in opposition in a basic way to the director, and the conflict was the method of the studio system. The producer was in charge. I approach my job as a producer and as a collaborator and partner, going back to the partnership with Paul Williams when we started, and when Paul and I started working together, I was the producer, he was the director, but we didn't set a fine line of demarcation of business and creative matters, but it was a true partnership, and we overlapped. And that kind of collusion and partnership with the filmmaker is what I look to recreate each time. It doesn't always work that way, but that's the ideal relationship. That's, for me, the most fulfilling, and it's a function of really establishing the context for that person, the filmmaker, to achieve his or her vision that I see is the fundamental function of a producer, which involves the financial context and the creative context, which varies from film to film and filmmaker to filmmaker. So when Oliver Stone was doing The Hand, he was a young filmmaker, and we were growing together, and I had to do a lot more in certain areas than I did when we did Wall Street or Talk Radio, because by that time he had his crew. We weren't just starting together. And with the Tavianis, I'll take an opposite one. With David Byrne, David was just learning the whole syntax of film. He didn't understand what a strip was on a schedule, or what a first AD was, really. So it was really starting from the very basic fundamentals and casting the crew and learning the whole process of filmmaking together, which was a very involving situation. With the Tavianis had their team for many years. They'd done their films with like a family, so our function was very different there. It was trying to make as sure as possible that the language issue was dealt with, that the casting would ring true for an American audience. So the functions vary, the involvement varies. from film to film, and with the same director from, director to director.
I'm curious, you mentioned Oliver Stone and The Hand, which I guess everybody always, when Platoon came out, everybody always referred to Platoon as Oliver Stone's first directing effort. A lot of people had that mistaken impression, and yet you knew him way back when with The Hand, which wasn't a movie that I think all that many people saw. Did you see at that point in that movie the director that was going to emerge later on? I mean, whether you like him or don't like him, a very successful director.
Well, I think I think that I get attracted to directors by very hard to define aspects, but intelligence and charisma and all those things that make a director inspire those around them, which in a communal work is what the director has to do, is what attracts me as well. So I'm being kind of seduced by the filmmaker in a sense.
And you saw that charisma at that time in Stone?
Yeah, I met Oliver actually when we were doing Conan the Barbarian. He wrote the script for Conan. He had shown me Platoon as a writing sample, and I thought it was just terrific. And he wrote a script for Conan, which was actually quite remarkable. It was not the final film that Milius shot. It was like kind of Dante's Inferno. It was still an attempt to write Platoon, and it was probably $60 million budget and impossible, but it was a great script. Working on The Hand, Oliver was going, he was in his most crazy period, I'd say, but he was amazingly creative, very exciting character, and always energized me intellectually. And after The Hand, I offered to produce. Wasn't immediately. He did. After The Hand, Oliver couldn't get arrested, so he and I didn't talk to each other for about 2 years because he thought, it was my fault. But after time, those wounds healed, and we became close again. And he asked if I wanted to produce Platoon. I was eager to do it, but then Dino came in, and other things happened, and I didn't get to do it. But I was eager to work with Oliver. I felt he would be a director.
The first film clip we're going to look at is from Badlands, which was one of your earlier films. And Terrence Malick, who directed the film, is an example of somebody who I think is a quite talented film director who pretty much got eaten up by the system and has dropped out. I don't know if you're in touch with him at all, but you'll see even in this brief clip of a story of a very nice young couple who casually went across the country killing people, that your taste is a little bit on the dark side. I mean, I think if you look through the body of your work, there is a kind of darkness and cynicism to them that certainly doesn't come across that much in your persona. Is that just coincidence in terms of the directors or am I misreading?
I don't think it's a coincidence because of the directors, but it's on account of the directors, because I think the filmmakers who are the truest artists are affected by the currents of their time, and at least the filmmakers I'm attracted to are somehow engaged, and I guess that's really.
Now, how did Badlands come about? How did you?
Terry was at Harvard with Paul Williams, and Terry had been trying to get Badlands made for a couple of years when we met. And I saw a film he did at the AFI, a short film, and got to know Terry over time, and basically was somehow convinced, it's hard to say how, to try to get it made. It was made for $300,000.
Oh my God.
And Terry had raised about 100, so I mean, at that time, I shouldn't say all, but our mission was to raise $200,000. And we had Arthur Penn, who was a friend of Terry's, who's put his name on as an executive producer to help. And we had Warren Oates as our big name. And basically, we got the film done on, I guess I borrowed the money. My mother helped. She was my banker.
Your mother was your banker.
And a credit card. And, everyone worked for nothing. It was a total commitment of everybody's to Terry. And Terry had that kind of magnetism that I was talking about, that filmmakers somehow personify in themselves the work they do, and in a different way than Oliver or Brian. Terry was more like David Byrne. He was very quiet, but he somehow inspires those around him to somehow believe that they're working with someone that's going to give that the film will have significance, not just be a job. That's the only way such a film could get made.
So let's take a look at some of it. Peter, could you run the clip from Badlands? This is Sissy Spacek and Martin Sheen, looking extremely young.
Yeah, Charlie Sheen is now the same age as Martin Sheen was in this film.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Sort of not your basic likable characters. It's been said that these are tough movies. I mean, really up and down the board. I mean, these are all movies about sort of the darker side of life, and especially now, they're not the kind of movies that Hollywood studios necessarily want to make or even distribute half the time, because they don't necessarily make huge amounts of money. And I wanted to know, you've obviously been doing it for a long time, is it possible to make money on these movies on a consistent basis? I mean, what is the audience for it, and is it both in the United States and internationally, and I guess now with video? Because these are tough films, and it's tough to find, I think, audiences, especially now, who will sit through them.
Well, I mean, for $300,000, this film was totally, justified as an economic endeavor, and I think that it's simply a economy of scale. If you make Wall Street, for $16 million. It needs to reach a wide audience to justify itself, but I don't think. I think what's great about a film like this, or True Stories, or To Sleep with Anger, is that those films can be rationalized artistically, but also economically, and I think the audience for such films is there in many parts of the world, and the problem is being able to reach the audience that wants to see it, and the studio system controls distribution to a large extent, but there are continually changes and ways to reach the audience. I mean, this film, Badlands was distributed by Warner Brothers, so it's, gets distributed all over, and it's been profitable for them as well. I mean, I think that the independent film is stronger now than it's ever been in America, and the independent movement is stronger now than it's ever been in history.
And why is that? Is that because the studios themselves? Why? I guess the question I've always had is that it's always seemed to make sense to me that economies of scale should sort of take place. That yes, if a movie costs $300,000 or $1 million to make, it costs less to get the money back. And I've never understood why the studios themselves haven't done that. And why is it they prefer to let independent producers make the low-budget pictures and then just pick them up? Why is it not profitable for them to do it?
Well, because they have a big overhead. I think
What is that overhead? They're always talking about the big overhead.
they've got an organization with, hundreds of millions of dollars of interest and real estate and personnel and all the things that make a studio operate, and they've got to supply basically a factory system. So the films they look to make are obviously the ones that will bring the greatest return, and those that are most predictable, because of that's the same way it's always been in the history of Hollywood. The idea of doing sequels is really not new. The studios just used to make the same film over again in different guises, the same story. It was a Western or thriller, and then they would reprocess the same stories over and over again. It was like a factory. I mean, the difference is when we made Badlands, there were 7 really institutional sources of financing and distribution that existed. There were no significant independent distributors. There was a company called Lopert, but that was about it. Nowadays there are video companies and cable companies and international conglomerates and many independent distributors that are in the business of making films and distributing them. So there are many, many more ways of getting such films made. When we made Badlands, we couldn't go to those places. We had to do it ourselves. When we made Sisters and Phantom, it really had to come out of our own pocketbook or do it as you would a Broadway show by selling shares. Nowadays there are, many real institutional ways of, when I say institutional, ongoing ways of finding ways to get films made. And the studios want right now to expand their distribution capabilities, and they can't afford to do everything themselves, and they look to bring in outside films more than they ever have before. I'd say over half the studio films released now are produced by independent companies, and some of the best films every year are independent generated films. Film like our film Reversal of Fortune, or even I guess Dances with Wolves was really generated by independent financing outside of America, and only was picked up by Orion, at the end. So it's a studio release like Reversal was, but they're financed independently, and that's been true constantly.
Just crazy. On the actual filmmaking process, how involved do you get with the day-to-day process of making a film? And I guess I read in one of the articles about you that it said that you reserve the right to have 6 arguments with a director per film. And I wanted to know when do you feel it's important to have those arguments? At what phase of the process? During the writing of the script, or the filming, or the editing?
That's sort of a kind of poetic license there. I think the point is not to make issues on every little thing, because you want to. If you have something important to disagree about, I think it's best to reserve your criticism for those real important things. Otherwise, it loses the impact. And I think the hardest thing for a producer to do, you're getting paid a lot of money to produce a movie. You got to do something, and it's often best not to do anything, and that's a hard thing to come to grips with, because if things are going well, if things are set up and you've done your job right, when the film is actually being made, there's very little to do. You become then a crisis manager if something goes wrong. So I tend to visit a set for an hour and leave. If there's a problem, I get involved, but there's nothing I can stand less than sitting around watching time go by. And the process is arduous. There's other things I can be doing more productively than just sitting and watching. And during the editorial process, I find it best, everybody's looking at the dailies, and in the case of a new director, I might be there a lot, but with someone who's made films before, who I trust, I prefer not to look at dailies. I'd rather look at the film when it's first assembled and give a more objective point of view, because I can be much more beneficial. Everyone's seen the dailies. There's a lot of smart people working on the film, and I think it's useful to have some detachment. So I prefer to not look at every day's rushes, to have that.
Is there a point at which, say for example on the film Walker, which was a movie about, based on a true story of an American who became the president of Nicaragua in the 19th century. It was a very interesting story. Ed Harris played the part, and the movie was not a success. I think, in my opinion, not too much critically, either critically or financially. And I think on that movie you took a risk with a director who was sort of a cult director, Alex Cox. Was there a point during the making of that movie where you said to yourself, oh my God, this isn't working, what do we do?
Not in the sense you're meaning. I always, I think that Alex is a piece of work, and it was very, very, the idea of the kind of partnership that I described, working with a director, as I did with Paul, or most every other director, was not the case with Alex. Once we started shooting, he became William Walker. But I always had tremendous respect for his work. I never lost confidence in that. I never lost confidence even when I saw the movie. I liked the movie. Mm-hmm. And I guess I liked it the second time I saw it, which is always a problem. And I liked it when I got into the music of Joe Strummer, and I got into the rhythm of it, and somehow I've come to perceive the film in a way that works for me, and I defend it to the last, but very few other people share that, I realize. But I never had doubt about the work. I really didn't. I had doubt about the sanity of going down to Nicaragua with Alex, doing this movie to come out alive, but that was for other much less rational reasons.
One of the filmmakers that you worked with a number of years ago was Brian De Palma. Sisters and Phantom of the Paradise. We're going to see a clip from Phantom of the Paradise next, which is, I saw it I haven't seen that movie for a while, and I forgot how intense it is. We actually saved you a little bit of the intensity of it. But I wanted to know, I think, actually when I spoke to your mother, she said, yeah, Eddie had a bunch of guys working in the back of the toy company. These directors were coming in and out. She said, you know, that guy that made those horror films. And I think that was Brian. And I wondered, how did you first hook up with him? Because I think Phantom was that after
Sisters.
After Sisters, so you'd already worked with him. And how did you first come in contact with him?
We were based in New York. And our office in New York was a kind of hangout for filmmakers. Besides Paul and Brian, it was Scorsese and a guy named Mark Stone and Jeff Young and a bunch of other people. And Brian was always the ringleader. We were friends during the making of Greetings and Hi Mom, and we basically hung out together. After Hi Mom, he made a deal with Ray Stark to do a couple of pictures, and he developed with Stark Sisters and Phantom of the Paradise. And Paul Williams and I were doing dealing up in Toronto, and Brian came to visit us and said he and Stark had this falling out, and could we save him from the relationship and pay Ray Stark back the money to get the rights free and do it together, and which I did. And so we'd known each other for 4 or 5 years, and at the time, actually, I had met George Lucas through Brian, and we were shooting Dealing in San Francisco as well as Toronto, and Brian and I met with George on a script called Cruisin', which he wanted to do, which turned into American Graffiti. And then Scorsese had a script called Gaga by Jay Cox, which ultimately, in a very kind of circuitous way, I believe, became Mean Streets. But in any case, we had a choice of doing these 3 movies, and we chose Sisters because it was Brian who I knew best, and so I didn't make American Graffiti. But I never had any regrets.
That's great. Well, we're going to roll a little bit of Phantom of the Paradise, which was Brian De Palma's version of Phantom of the Opera set in the record industry. And this scene that you're going to see is pretty much near the end of the movie when all the deals with the devil are about to...
Yeah, it's a mixture of Phantom of the Opera and Dorian Gray.
Yeah.
Faust.
And it goes on from there.
No, this is the end of it. You got to understand what led up to it.
Tell me, does it bother you at all that you give all these guys their start? Oliver Stone and Brian De Palma and his early work, and Terry Malick, and then they make the films with you that sort of get people's attentions, and then when they go off to make their sort of bigger films, they move on. Is that something that's would you like to go on with them as they go on to bigger films, or is that just something that's not of interest to you?
No, I've worked with Oliver in the beginning, and then we worked again on Wall Street and Talk Radio, and I hope to work with him again. I hope to work with Brian again. I think I don't think there's any. I think when we started, I think the ability I had to deliver at the level that the filmmakers required was limited, so that when Brian was doing his early films, I was really able to help. at that level. But I think at this point, my peers have grown up with me, not just in the creative community, but at the studios and other places. So I have much better access now to getting films launched at a studio level or at an independent level, so that I'm better able to provide the help that such a filmmaker would want. So I would hope to work with directors who are established as well as first timers, and continue to do that.
Have you ever been offered any kind of deal to work within a studio, to have a deal sort of like Goober and Peters did before they went off to Columbia at Warner Brothers, where they had an exclusive producing deal? Have you ever been offered that kind of thing, or do you prefer to stay outside of the...
Well, we had it once, right after Phantom. Fox thought Phantom was going to be a much bigger hit than it was, and they gave us a contract which was for 2 years. And right after that, the management changed, and it was the least productive period of my life. And the relationship that offered has always seemed to mean to me that I should keep my options open.
Because they have to approve what you're doing?
There's the problem. There are all kinds of deals made, but in that arrangement, if we got a salary, so we were paid whether a film was made or not, and there was money to buy scripts and stuff, but they didn't want to make anything we brought them. And then if we took it elsewhere, it was tarnished, or it was inhibited by Fox's ability to take it over if anyone else wanted to. So it was just a very unproductive relationship. But there are different kinds of relationships that one can have with studios, and we've had discussions recently, and if we could find a way to work with the studio and do the films we want to make, that's ideal. In other words, every film I want to make, I go to the studios first, and if they want to finance it and distribute it, that's the easiest way to do it. I'm not against that at all. I'm not independent because I'm against the studios. I work through the studio system. It's only if the studios don't want to do a film that I have to find other creative ways of financing, and then I have to come back to the studios anyway for distribution. So if an arrangement could be achieved to distribute films with a studio and still have the ability to make the films that we want to make, there's nothing wrong with that.
I'm just curious how much, the film business is so covered now everywhere in all the magazines and newspapers, and, it seems like everybody knows about Spago or the Ivy or, wherever it is, and Michael Ovitz, the head of CAA, and how the agents are running the business. And I was wondering, if you're in your position, you have a very good track record, what is your line to people like Michael Ovitz at the big agencies in terms of lining up the directors and the stars and the people you need? Will he return your phone call the same day, or what is the...
I think over time there's at least a credibility that if I say we're going to make a film, we'll make it, so that the agents are responsive. They're not... I'm not signed to any one agency, but again, over time I've developed a certain confidence factor with the agents, and what the agents really do is provide access. They don't really tell a star what they should do. I don't think the idea that they have the power to tell Dustin Hoffman what picture he's going to do, or that Mike Ovitz can tell Tom Cruise what to do, is as powerful as people imagine. But I think what the agent provides is access. They can deny you access, and I think that that's, again, over time and credibility, I've gained much more access than I had in the past.
Do you see it waxing and waning according to the, I mean, is the business as cynical as, one might be led to believe, so that after Walker, your access might be a little bit less, and now after Reversal of Fortune being a success, or at least, a success, that people will now be quicker to get back to you? Is it quite as brutal as that?
I think maybe with some people, but not with many. I think, I've friends that, who knows, next week it could change. I feel okay today.
Well, that's good. That's good. You've worked with a number of foreign directors as well as American directors, and in fact, one of the film clips that we're going to look at is from Das Boot, which is really so good. I just looked at it again. It's such a tight, great film, and I was wondering, in a picture like that, how do you, with Wolfgang Petersen in that case, I mean, how did you come about to get to know him, and and what's the difference in terms of getting a film like that produced and distributed and the money raised as opposed to an American?
Right. Well, that's a long story. When we were involved with Das Boot, it was at a time I was in Munich doing a film with Bo Widerberg, and the opportunity presented itself to do that film and the Fassbinder film, Despair, in partnership with Bavaria Studios and a German tax shelter group called Guerilla, if we could provide the other third of the financing from the States. And the intention was that Das Boot would be what was called an international film, meaning an American film. And so we developed a screenplay, which is the screenplay that was eventually shot. And we built the submarine, and we hired John Sturgis to direct, and Richard Dreyfuss to play the captain, and Tony Richmond was the cameraman. And we were well into pre-production when Buchheim, the author of the book, appeared and claimed that our script was anti-German. In fact, it was, pacifist against war, but not against Germans in particular. Buchheim had been an assistant to Himmler during the war, so when this erupted, Dreyfuss started announcing to the German press that this was, anti-Semitic, and Sturgis and Dreyfuss walked off the film, and the film came to a stop. We had done what we promised, but no one told us that the author had script approval legally. So the picture stopped. The money we had put up was returned. We were given 2.5% of the profits, executive producer credit, and that was the end of it. 3 years later, the film was revived by Bavaria Studios with the same boat sitting there. And unfortunately, I had nothing to do with it.
But was the script the same script? And then because it sounds...
Yeah, it was the same script. There was a scene that Buchheim objected to, which was hypothecated in the book, but dramatized in the script, where the enemy sailors are in the water and the Germans look at them as they're drowning, and according to German rules of war, if the enemy's there because of security, you shoot them. And in the book, it hypothesized what he would do. In the script, we said, they're shot, and then the captain was going to be very tormented. It's not like they were cruel, but Bookheim said that was not dramatized in the book. You dramatized it in the script, so you've got to take that out, and that's what created the issue, because that was the only real issue. So anyway, I think the film obviously turned out much better than it would have had it been made as an international production than as a German film. So I can't take responsibility for that.
Well, I think you can, because the script was
for part of it, yeah.
Yeah, the script was the script that
Right,
was developed, because
right.
it's quite a pacifist movie.
Right.
And the segment that we're going to see now is as the submarine there's a strafing from above and the submarine starts to sink. Now, lest everybody think that, you're always involved in sort of serious films, there is Conan. I think trying to think of you and Arnold Schwarzenegger in a room together, it's kind of a daunting thought. And I was wondering, did you have anything to do with the casting of Arnold, and what was your relationship with him?
I discovered Arnold. No, Jerome Gary was making a film called Pumping Iron, which was being edited, and I was living in New York, and he asked if I would look at it for advice. I saw Arnold's image and his personality, and there was an immediate impact. And I was with someone. I asked, there must be a movie for this fellow, and he said, "Oh, well, don't you know about Conan the Barbarian?" I said, "No." So we went to this fellow's bookstore. He had a comic book store called Super Snipe in New York, which was actually backed by George Lucas. And he introduced me to this whole world of Robert Howard and the Frank Frazetta paintings, and it was like something I knew nothing about. And it was a cinematic conception to me right away. And on the cover was this Frazetta painting, which was Arnold. And so Arnold was the reason that Conan became of interest. And we made an agreement with Arnold that he would do 3 films with us as Conan. We became very good friends. We spent a great deal of time together for a couple of years trying to get Conan made. A lot of people thought it was, like the old sword and sandal movies with Steve Reeves, and the genre of sword and sorcery was in fact something new. I think it's an interesting genre and as original in its own way as some of the other films that may be more serious in some way, but I think it's an interesting film. I think that it took us 7 years to get the film made, and Arnold stuck with us for the last 4 of them, and we went through many different ways of getting it made. Oliver wrote the script, but the script was impractical. We even thought this was before the hand. We thought maybe Oliver could direct it, but he couldn't direct the action stuff. So we got Joe Alves, who had done this second unit direction on Jaws and the special effects, and we actually thought for a few months that we'd have 2 people directing it. A first-time director, Oliver, and Joe Alves. It's like the Taviani brothers. And that was, not a good idea. And we talked, well, in the very beginning, I went to John Milius, and Milius said he'd do it, and then he went off to do Big Wednesday, so we lost him for a long time. And in the meantime, we went with Alan Parker, Ridley Scott, there were many people interested, and then things would happen and they would change their mind. And then John came back, and we did it with John, and John and Oliver had a kind of, combative relationship, and the script changed, and that became the movie. And to me, actually, the first half of that movie I think is terrific.
I always thought it was a lot better. In fact, I thought we should just see it, just a little bit of Arnold, just to show. Just imagine Ed and Arnold, and could you just show us? I don't know if any of you saw the Doors movie. I think that's in the Doors as well.
I think you're trying to tell me something here, Julie. This film has much more eloquence than that.
I have to tell you, this is the one clip I hadn't seen. I just told them to pick something with Arnold in it. I didn't I'm going to talk to the projection. That's my Wow. Sorry.
It's a textual analysis.
Wow, that was quite a scene there. I don't know how to go from this to my next question, so I'm just going to break. 1990 was a tough year for Hollywood. But maybe not as bad as the last 5 minutes have been for me. Big budget pictures were the failures in 1990. Avalon, Bonfire of the Vanities, Havana, all cost a fortune and all lost and did not do well at the box office. And so after that, you have all the studio executives in Hollywood coming out saying, oh, we're not going to make expensive movies anymore. We're all going back to doing what you do, making reasonably budgeted movies. But at the same time, in the next week in the trade, you read Bruce Willis is getting $10 million, Demi Moore is getting $8 million. And you kind of say to yourself, well, how can this be? How can they make modestly budgeted pictures when they're paying the stars such exorbitant amounts of money? And I guess what I wanted to ask you is, in the wake of this sort of, breastfeeding and saying we're going to be monks now and make modest movies, does this affect you? Is this a good thing for you? Because do people now look to you as somebody who's going to supply them with reasonably priced product?
Well, I think there are always contradicting tendencies going on in Hollywood. I think there's a real effort on account of just market factors and the fact that companies like Fox and Time Warner are very highly leveraged, have tremendous interest payments, and they can't spend as freely as they did. And the companies that have actually had usually the strongest runs have been companies that have been on top of the form and not spending the most money, doing Paramount in the 70s or Disney in the mid 80s, and maybe Fox right now. But at the same time, probably the most expensive film ever made is about to come out at $105 million for Terminator 2. And the money that Matsushita and Sony have brought to Universal and Columbia give those studios, certainly Columbia over the last year, an inclination to spend as freely or more freely than ever. a film like Hook, the Spielberg film with Robin Williams, is going to cost a fortune, and so there's this contradicting trend. I think that generally, I think that this seems to go in cycles, and I remember again in the mid-'70s when after Sound of Music, and the answer was big musicals, and then they made Star and Finian's Rainbow and a bunch of very expensive flops, and then Easy Rider came out, and the tendency was then let's make low-budget films, and then they lost a fortune taking that turn, and after Jaws the same thing happened, and then came Porky's and they went the other way. And, I mean, so there's this yin and yang going on, and I think that the current today's theme is, at least for the official record, is generally more towards look at Home Alone, look at Pretty Woman, look at Ghost, look at these films as models of smart thinking. So in that in that context, our way of making films is definitely appealing, and the idea that we can lower the average is, I think, an advantage. But we're doing a film called Hoffa with Danny DeVito and probably Jack Nicholson, and that's going to be very expensive.
And what's very expensive?
I don't know yet. But above average.
And what's average now? 18 million for a picture in Hollywood?
I think 25.
25.
I mean, we've done mostly films. I don't think we've ever done a film that expensive. I think we haven't done a film that expensive.
25 million.
Right. I mean, Conan was 18. It depends who you ask. If you ask Dino was one price, Universal another price, but somewhere in that area, 18 to $20 million. To Sleep with Anger was $1.2 million. Reversal of Fortune was about 15. The David Mamet film we just finished is around 7. So they're all certainly well below the average, but there's some situations where the studios will reach to pay the stars. I think that the Japanese financing is a big factor for those studios to be able to survive in that climate, because I think that no matter what, I think the studios that are more financially strapped are not going to do that. I think Corelco is a company that's doing Terminator 2, and that's a big test, because if they did Total Recall, which cost about $70 million, and it was their most profitable film. So they have projections based on Terminator 2, which they expect to do very well, and it'll be interesting to see, because the balloon has burst before, and these cycles have usually come to an end with a lot of very expensive disasters like Heaven's Gate or whatever. And I don't know, did Bonfires really change Warner's thinking? I don't know.
They say it has, but then who knows? Because,
I mean, they're doing Batman 2, and I'm sure they're going to...
And they just hired Bruce Willis to do a big action picture, and I'm sure that he didn't do it for nothing. Next film clip. Sorry.
No, I was just saying it's a brand name psychology, and that makes sense. It's just being, what brand is really going to work.
And you created Arnold, so I guess you have to take some responsibility for this in some way. The next film clip we're going to see is from True Stories, which was David Byrne's directorial debut. It was a musical about life in Virgil, Texas, and the scene we're going to see is actually somewhat appropriate to this discussion about the absurdity of the way Hollywood thinks. $105 million for a film is almost incomprehensible to imagine, but in the scene we're going to see, the leading town industrialist, played by Spalding Gray, a man who hasn't spoken to his wife for 20 years or ever, and they're sitting around the family table, and he's explaining to David Byrne, who's the visitor in town, about industry.
Well, the woman at the table, Spalding Gray's wife, is played by my wife, Annie McEnroe. I should say that because
she's very good. She has her own musical number in this.
Yes.
So we're going to see the family. It's not your family, is it, Ed? You guys can talk to one another. The last movie we're going to see a clip from is going to be Reversal of Fortune, which has done quite well by you, I think, recently. Jeremy Irons won an Academy Award, deservedly so, I think, for his portrayal of Klaus von Bülow. And I think this picture, in a lot of ways, really represents Ed Pressman. It's sort of, this is what you do. I mean, you have a very American story in a lot of ways, Reversal of Fortune, the Klaus von Bülow case, based on a book written by an American lawyer and self-promoter, Alan Dershowitz, an English actor, and a somewhat German and somewhat other things director, Barbet Schroeder. What is he exactly? He's German.
No, he's Swiss. Grew up in Colombia.
Yeah.
And he has a man of no particular nationality.
A man of no particular nationality. And I was wondering, how did this come together?
Barbet actually has an accent in every language.
He has an accent.
No, he does.
How did you put Reversal together?
How long do we have?
Not too long.
Right. No, let's see. Basically started with. I've always had student drivers because I tend to bump into things when I drive myself. In LA, you're always in the road, so I do my work in car. And the film student who was driving me was Elon Dershowitz, Alan's son. I didn't know who Alan was. One day he handed me a manuscript after he was working for me for 4 months and said, what do you think of this? I read it, and I was taken with it right away as an exploration of class system, society in America, the legal process. There were a lot of things that intrigued me. And I met with Nick Kazan, who took a point of view on how the script might be written, which sold me on the idea that it could be a movie. It was really Nick's conception. The idea, by the way, of the voiceover of Sonny was Brian's idea.
Brian De Palma.
Yeah, which I suggested to Nick after Brian said the only way you can tell this story is from Sonny's point of view. Nick liked that idea. The original director was someone else, not Barbet.
Who was it?
Hugh Hudson. And we spent 2 years trying to satisfy Hugh's demands on the script. He was never satisfied. And after 2 years, I'd never been in this situation before, but I actually had to make a decision to find someone else because it was just not, we weren't even close to getting the script to satisfy what Hugh wanted it to be, and we couldn't figure out what that was, and it was just not getting anywhere. So at that time, Barbet, who I'd known for years, we worked together to try to get Barfly going early on before Mickey Rourke with Jimmy Woods. And we were friends. We met. Barbet had an idea for a movie and said he wished he could get Nick Kazan to write the script. I said, well, I just happen to have a script by Nick Kazan. Would you be interested in reading it? He read it and loved it, and the idea of Barbet doing it seemed logically interesting to me, because Barbet had, when he was married in Niarchos and Onassis were at his wedding, he knew that world. He also knew the other world that Barfly reflected. He understood evil, Idi Amin, and he's a very bright fellow. So Barbet loved the script. Barbet didn't want to change it at all. So that made it solved one big problem. And Barbet actually, because English is not his native language, had a great respect for the word and for Nick. And in fact, during the whole shooting, Nick had a beeper on him. So when he was in LA or wherever he was, Barbet could reach him. And if there were changes to be done or whatever, Nick was very, very intimately involved. But from the point we had a script that we liked and the director, the problem of getting the film made was just beginning. The studios all turned down the screenplay to finance. So we had to find another way to do it. We made a deal with Glenn Close. We made a deal with Jeremy. The casting was much more circuitous than that. But at a certain point, we had part of the cast in place, but no one still wanted to make the movie. And we were committed, basically, to make it, because we had gone pay or play with the actors. So we got Sochiku, a Japanese company. You know, it was, it was like a 4 or 5 year process, but that was how it came to be. The film itself was always kind of a stepchild at Warner's, because they didn't have a lot of money in it, and they kept putting up tests for the film. Let's see how it plays in Telluride, and let's see how it plays in Toronto, and let's see what happens when it opens. And the reviews were good, and the film did well, but they had opened it at a time when they didn't think it was going to play long, and they had all the Christmas films coming in, and they also had Goodfellas playing, and they were definitely behind that. So the film really had to come out of the theaters when the Christmas films came in. But fortunately, it got the nominations and then received the Oscar, and so now it's back in 400 theaters, and it's doing pretty well. And it's been a long process, because it was an independent film and not something that Warner's had a stake in from the beginning. But in the end, it's played out on its own merit, so it's come out fine.
I'm just curious, how much money had it made before Christmas, and how much of a difference did the Oscar actually made in terms of the box office receipts?
I'd say it'll do another 50%.
Another 50% because of that. Well, the scene that you're about to see is just great. It's lunch between Alan Dershowitz, played by Ron Silver, and Klaus von Bülow, where it's a scene in which Alan Dershowitz is trying to decide whether he wants to take the case or not. And I think you'll see just from this clip exactly, if you haven't seen the movie, why Jeremy Irons won the Academy Award for this picture. I'm really getting close to. I think I'd like to let any of you ask some questions if you'd like to. Any questions? No hands? Yes, sir.
I'd like to know, Mr. Pressman, what is the film that you're most proud of?
And the question is, what is the film that Mr. Pressman is most proud of?
I think of the 34 films, probably a dozen of them. It's hard to pick one. I
Pick
think.
two.
I keep, reminding me what I've been working on and what I've been doing, and I circle the ones that I think I like to think of. So I got, like, I'll read the ones out of it. Sisters and Phantom, Badlands, Das Boot, Heartbeat, Conan, Plenty. She didn't like Plenty. True Stories, Good Morning Babylon, Wall Street, Walker, Blue Steel, Talk Radio, Reversal of Fortune, and To Sleep with Anger.
Yes, sir.
Mr. President, you mentioned some of these films take you anywhere from 5 to 7 years from the beginning to completion. What rate would you say that you start with actually going through it?
I think of the films that we start working on, we make about a little over 2/3 of what we start. I think the studios probably do, 1 out of 200, but we don't have the means to. We can't operate on that basis. We've got to make pretty much what we start.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Pressman, I read a couple of years ago that you bought the rights to a story about the life of Dean Reed. He was a close personal friend of mine for 20 years and came to Minnesota 3 times. And there are a number of people here who felt that when I mentioned that you had bought the rights that an honest film would be made about someone who might be very controversial. Could you tell us where that project might be right now?
Well, at the moment, our rights have lapsed. That we were involved for a while trying to get a handle on the best approach, because it could be approached so many different ways, and there are a lot of different theories. The person that we got the rights from was a friend of Reed's also.
Will Roberts.
Who?
Will Roberts?
No.
Oh,
Teacher at Antioch. But at the same time, the BBC said they were going to do a film, which never turned out, but we were kind of concerned because we hadn't even gotten the script started and they were doing their film, so we let the rights lapse. It's an interesting subject, and the change in the climate politically with Russia made us think also that maybe the times and the pertinence of it would be less relevant somehow. But then again, it may be interesting again in a whole different light. With a little, things were changing, have been changing so rapidly there that the kind of, do you know the Dean Reed story? Dean Reed was a American who went to, became a superstar, as big as Bob Dylan and Elvis Presley all rolled into one in Russia and in East Germany and the Soviet bloc. He was the biggest recording star, actor, made movies, and he died under mysterious circumstances. Some people thought the CIA had done it, some people thought the KGB had done it, some people thought he committed suicide. What do you think?
no, he wasn't the type of person to commit suicide.
Right.
I don't think we'll ever know.
Right. Anyway, it's an interesting subject.
Thank you.
Yes.
I want to know what happens with the Sleep with Anger. It seemed like a very exceptional film. And I wonder how much control independent producers have over the distribution of films that they make.
Right. That's really the toughest problem. Like I said, there's a lot more ways of getting films made now than there used to be. But the distribution of the film, once it's made, is the real problem. I think a mistake was made, an honest mistake, but a mistake, in the distribution of To Sleep with Anger. The Goldwyn Company that distributed the film, bought it after it was completed, and because of Danny Glover being the star, the notion was that this film might be able to be sold as a Danny Glover movie, like Lethal Weapon 3 or something. And we only had about $750,000 for our agreement to spend on marketing the movie. And about half of that was spent on a test engagement in Atlanta and a couple of other cities in a very wide release with television advertising. And the experiment failed, and we used up half our money. And so when it opened subsequently as a kind of very limited, art film kind of release, we didn't have much money to keep the film alive. Even so, without any money, the film, did over $1 million, just hanging on week to week in a few cities where it at least got established. San Francisco, New York, and LA, Boston. I don't know how it did here, but generally across the country it came and went, and there was no money to advertise it, left, so there was nothing to do about it, and the structure of the financing had been kind of preordained. It was funded by a Sony company that became kind of an orphan to the Columbia Sony company. Sony had financed the film before they bought Columbia Pictures, and then they bought Columbia Pictures, but the division of Sony that financed the film was kind of absorbed, and the management left, and there was no one there to get an answer from, and there was no way to get the deal adjusted. We tried very hard, and we got what was agreed to in front, and that was all we could get.
Yes. You, yeah.
I was just curious what became of Paul Williams, who directed the first 3 films?
Well, Paul, after the third film, Dealing, kind of dropped out, became interested in politics and other things other than film, and went to Eureka training. Remember that? And I guess gave away all his possessions, and went through got divorced, and then recently we stayed friends. Recently he's decided to try to come back to direct again, which is a hard thing to do. But he's got a script that Dennis Hopper wants to do, and he's trying to do it up in Montreal, and I'm trying to help, if I can. He's living out in LA.
Yes.
What is the record meaning of the title of the
Charles is much more eloquent than I am explaining that. It's about frustration, quiet kind of anger. It's poetry. I'm not sure. Oh, I don't think so.
Somebody had a question? Yes.
I really enjoyed the film True Stories, and I'm just curious now that you mentioned that you get a little bit more involved with David Byrne because of the first-time filmmaker. I'm wondering if number one, if the film was financially successful, and also if you had a chance to talk to David Byrne again about producing another film, because I've heard that he's very interested in doing so.
True Stories was made for around $3 million, and half of it was provided by Warner Records, so the movie company actually only put up $1.5 million. So at that level, it was considered successful. It did very well on video. As far as working with David again, we're talking about a couple of projects. He does want to direct again, and he's got 2 projects that we're talking about, and maybe others also. I know the one we're furthest along on is about involves the kind of Latin rhythms that some of his latest albums have explored, Brazilian music stuff.
Yes.
You seem to support directors and directors. I'm curious about your own vision. How do you view works through your eyes, and how important is that to you? Because up until now, it's really been the director's vision, but you as a director, I'm curious about your own, especially with your background in the technical.
Well, I guess I take a kind of vicarious creative pleasure. What I'm good at is identifying through the eyes of my partner and taking that trip. I didn't know a lot about Nicaraguan politics before getting involved with Walker, but through that process, I became much more learned, and I think that's what galvanizes me is the other person, and that's not to say I don't become involved or just say it's your fix, but I can identify and feel we're talking the same language, and I think that's why the filmmaker would come to me as well, because it's a process of being able to speak the same language. That's really what it comes down to, and it's things that are sometimes easy to verbalize and sometimes not. I think, in the case of Reversal, the real partner was Nick, and on Plenty was David Hare. So it's not always the director, but I find I don't have the talent or the confidence or the inclination to write myself or direct myself. I think what I do, though, I think is very critical and very fulfilling and totally fulfilling in a creative way for myself, in the way that, say, going into the toy business wasn't. I find, creative fulfillment in, the role of producer, which I think generally is kind of demeaned as a title for all kinds of reasons, and as a function.
Well, I think you do very much present your own vision, and you just get other people to put it on the screen for you. But I found this very interesting. I thank you, and I thank you for letting me come. Thank you.
Thank you.